Is the new Superman movie making the same mistake as Spider-Man 3 and the Amazing Spider-Man 2? They've already confirmed over 20 characters, including 3 members of the Justice Society and 4 villains: Lex Luthor, Ultraman, the Engineer, and the Hammer of Baravia. I'm not even counting Rick Flag Sr. and this Kaiju, who are supposed to be smaller antagonists. We've seen this kind of villain overload in superhero movies before, and it usually doesn't go very well. But is James Gunn gonna pull it off where Sam Raimi and Mark Webb couldn't? Or is Superman gonna get slammed for not being able to juggle all these villains? That's what we're gonna talk about today. You don't need to be a screenwriting expert to realize that squeezing more than one villain into a movie is tough. It's hard to have enough time to develop more than one bad guy, especially if you've got to tell their whole origin story, explain why they hate the hero, and go over their powers. That's exactly what happened to Sam Raimi in Spider-Man 3. Nobody would dare saying Raimi doesn't know how to write great villains, because Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus are some of the best villains in superhero movie history. But in Spider-Man 3, he didn't have enough time to make the villains iconic. The only one who had a solid backstory was Harry. He should have been the only villain in that movie, because they had been building him up really well since Spider-Man 1. But they also had to introduce and develop Sandman and Venom from scratch. Raimi tried to humanize Flint Marko by showing his daughter's story, and he tried to connect him with Peter by retconning Uncle Ben's death. But that subplot had no connection to Peter's conflict with Eddie Brock, or Eddie turning into Venom. It's also got nothing to do with Harry losing his memory, or with Harry wanting to get revenge on Peter because he blames him for his daddy's death. They told 3 totally different stories all at once.
It's too much!
Each of these villains had the potential to be the main bad guy in a Spider-Man movie, but since they were all crammed into one story, they all ended up losing impact. They don't even come together until the last 20 minutes in the final fight. By then, Peter's already used his talk no jutsu on Harry, but it all just feels slapped together because none of their storylines really link up. And it was kind of forced that Sandman teamed up with Venom, since their goals and methods are totally different. The problem was time and too many storylines. This could happen again in Superman, especially since James Gunn's movie is actually a few minutes shorter than Spider-Man 3. And it looks like the Hammer of Baravia's story won't have anything to do with Lex Luthor's. Apparently, Luthor's gonna try to ruin Superman's rep out of jealousy and kidnap him, along with other metahumans like Metamorpho. But the Hammer of Baravia shows up when Superman tries to stop a war in the Middle East. Unless this guy turns out to be Ultraman in disguise, or maybe it's actually Lex in a suit, and they just changed the colors in the trailer, we're probably looking at 2 separate villain plots that don't connect.
Oh no!
But before we panic, let's look at what happened in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. This movie also had 3 villains who at first glance didn't have much to do with each other. Alexei Sitsevich is a mobster who only turns into Rhino at the end, and they don't even explain how he gets his mech suit. Harry's mad at Spidey because he wouldn't give him blood to cure his weird genetic disease. And Max hates Spidey too, but only because he's more popular, and he's jealous. All 3 villains had pretty weak motivations, but the funny thing is Mark Webb actually managed to give them some things in common. Rhino's only in 2 scenes, so they got him out of the way pretty fast. The real focus is on Harry and Max. They team up because they both want to sneak into Oscorp. They're both mad at their bosses and want revenge on the Oscorp execs and Spidey, so it kind of makes sense for them to work together. What really felt forced was Harry suddenly becoming the Goblin in the last 15 minutes just to kill Gwen. So the problem with The Amazing Spider-Man 2 wasn't really the subplots, it was lack of time and character development. That's not a great sign, because that movie is 20 minutes longer than Superman. Even with that extra time, they couldn't even balance 2 villains, so how's James Gunn supposed to pull it off? It seems like some sort of mission impossible, but he can do it. The main difference with these 2 movies is that Superman is gonna have one main villain, and that's gonna be Lex Luthor. Ultraman and the Engineer are basically his henchmen, so they're not gonna get that much screen time. They don't need deep, complicated motivations, or as much focus as the bad guys in Spider-Man 3 or The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I wouldn't be surprised if the Engineer ends up playing a role similar to Adam Warlock in Guardians, and turns on Lex to help Superman. But even so, their stories are tied directly to Lex, because they work for him. James Gunn doesn't need to juggle totally separate plots just to get all the villains in the same room. They're already on the same team from the start, and the spotlight's gonna stay on Lex.
Man, that's easier said than done.
We've got to keep in mind, Gunn didn't have studio pressure to cram in all these characters. He did it because he wanted to, which wasn't the case with Spider-Man 3. Raimi said many times in interviews that he didn't get Venom. He wasn't from his favorite era of comics, and he didn't even like the character. But Sony's execs were convinced people would flood the theaters if they saw posters of Spidey in the black suit. Also, Venom was already super popular in the comics, and had a ton of fans from the 90s cartoon. So from a marketing point of view, it made total sense to include him in the movie. And even though no one wants to admit it, they weren't wrong. Spider-Man 3 pulled in a total of $891 million, and it was the most successful Spidey movie at the box office, until Far From Home came along. And that's not even counting inflation. But they pushed the director to use a character he didn't like, and the end result came out kinda weak, since they focused more on big-name villains than telling a solid story. Maybe if Raimi had picked a third villain he actually liked, like Vulture, Spider-Man 3 could have been way better, and that whole saga might have kept going.
That is not fair!
Something similar happened with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Mark Webb had to cram in a bunch of villains, because Sony wanted to launch a Sinister Six spin-off. That's why Rhino shows up, and that's why we see the Sinister Six teased in the credits. But since the movie didn't get the reception the studio was hoping for, that spin-off never made it to theaters. Once again, Sony forced a director to add too many villains in one movie, just because they thought it would boost sales. Mark Webb might not be the greatest director of all time, but I'm sure he could have told a much better story if he hadn't been juggling so many characters. But James Gunn doesn't have that kind of studio pressure, because he is the studio. Besides directing and writing Superman, Gunn is also the head of DC Studios. You know, the studio that produces the movie. Sure, he's not Warner's CEO, and at the end of the day, he still has to answer to David Zaslav. But nobody told Gunn to throw in a bunch of characters just to sell more tickets. Every villain in this movie is there because he wants them there, because he must have a story where they all serve a purpose. Instead of being forced to write characters he doesn't like, to make some out-of-touch executive happy, Gunn has full creative freedom to use the villains he wants.
I started this company.
Gunn also had a front row seat to how the Avengers movies were made, back when he was working in the MCU, so he knows it's totally possible to tell a solid story with a huge cast. And I'm pretty sure he noticed that the highest grossing superhero movies from the last decade haven't been solo stories, they've been crossovers. Sure, those movies have emotional and exciting stories, but let's be real, people don't just want one hero versus one villain anymore. No Way Home, Doctor Strange 2, and Deadpool and Wolverine prove that the audience wants to see heroes teaming up, and if possible, lots of villains too. It's no coincidence that the most hyped superhero projects are Avengers-level crossovers, with a bunch of characters. And we can't forget, this isn't just a Superman story, it's the start of a whole new universe. If packing in a bunch of different heroes and villains is what gets people running to the theater, then I can't blame Gunn. This is the first time we're seeing something like this. Man of Steel, for example, didn't really connect to a larger universe, except for a quick shot of a Wayne Industries satellite. Back then, Warner hadn't even announced this movie would kick off a bigger universe, so it didn't need to build hype. Something similar happened with Iron Man 1, which, aside from the post-credits scene, works as a totally standalone story. Kevin Feige and the rest of the team said they added that scene just to see what would happen. They didn't really have the whole thing mapped out. There weren't announcements for other projects, and it wasn't clear how things would connect. They even considered making a deal with Fox to bring the MCU together with the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, but that plan went nowhere. But Superman is different, because Gunn already announced this is the start of a new shared universe. The Supergirl movie, the Clayface film, and the Lantern show already have release dates. And they've also announced a bunch of other interconnected projects. They have to tell a great Superman story and bring the character back as a true icon, but at the same time, they've got to convince us it's worth getting invested in this new universe. And if the way to do that is by throwing in a bunch of characters to get people hyped, then that's fine. They're just giving the audience what they want. But that doesn't mean it has to feel forced. Superman can work just like a comic. Most DC comics that are set in the main continuity are packed with cameos and guest appearances. It's normal to see other heroes show up in Superman's regular series, or in any book starring a big-name character. That's kind of the whole point of having a shared universe. For example, in Action Comics issue 1077 by Mark Waid, Martian Manhunter, Flash, and Mr. Terrific all show up out of nowhere because the sun is dying. It makes sense that a bunch of Earth's heroes would be concerned, but that doesn't mean they take the spotlight away from Superman. It would feel a bit weird if no one else got involved when the entire planet is in danger. But this is still a Superman comic, and it never feels overcrowded with DC characters. Gunn's doing the same thing. He wants us to get used to a shared comic book style universe where all kinds of characters pop in and out. But that doesn't mean all of them are going to have a ton of screen time.
I'm not convinced.
If the Hammer of Baravia has nothing to do with Lex or Ultraman, they can still treat him like another villain in the DC universe, who just happens to clash with Superman. There's no need to dive deep into his motivations, or give him a tragic backstory, so people can relate to him. He's just there to fight Superman for a bit, and that's fine. It's not filler either, because the point of this fight is to make people start doubting Superman. Looks like there's gonna be a trial, or some kind of political fallout, because he intervenes in a foreign conflict. And some people think Superman should answer to the US only. What matters isn't the Hammer of Baravia as a villain, it's the debate his battle sparks about Superman's actions. His appearance doesn't have to overload the film, as long as it adds something to the story and themes. That wasn't the case with the villains in Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. All of this sounds great, But there's one big issue. Everything I've said so far could fall apart if the leaked toys turn out to be real. A few days ago, some photos popped up of a 6-inch figure set called Luthor Corp Lab. The set includes Superman, Metamorpho, Mr. Terrific, Crypto, and Lex Luthor in a green armor. If this is real, then we're about to see Lex in his classic comic book armor on the big screen for the first time. That means he's not just going to be the mastermind behind everything, or Superman's philosophical enemy, who stands for everything the Man of Steel isn't. He's actually going to throw hands with Superman in the third act. And then we're really going to have a lot of villains. In the last half hour of the film, Superman would go up against the Engineer, Ultraman, and Lex Luthor.
There are too many of them.
I'll admit, it'd be cool to see Lex in action, since it's never been done in live action before. Except you want to count a couple of scenes in Superman and Lois. But it's going to be super difficult to do him justice in just 15 minutes. It would feel like they're rushing things, because it'd be smarter to save this move for a second or third Superman movie, where Lex is trying to become president. If Gunn pulls from the Public Enemy's storyline, Lex could make it to the White House and create his own superhero team. But then Superman and Batman can expose him as a corrupt fraud. In a fit of rage, Lex would try to take out Superman once and for all with his bare hands, or using his suit, which is almost the same. This story would be awesome, but if they try to squeeze all of that into the final minutes of this first movie, it's gonna feel rushed and forced. It'd be reminiscent of what happened with the Green Goblin in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. What's worse is they'd be wasting a villain who could be super interesting in future projects, even as the main bad guy for the whole saga. It's almost impossible to pull this off. But there's still hope. It's pretty likely that Lex won't wear the armor at all. Even if the toys are real, we've got to remember that toy companies often use designs that don't show up in the final cut. There were Vulture toys for No Way Home, and he wasn't even close to appearing in that movie. They included him in the sets because the design was already made, and the movie's hype would help sell more. That's probably what's going on here too. The folks who put this set together saw a chance to sell toys of Lex wearing an armor, because they know fans want to see that. It's also possible this is not totally made up. Maybe Gunn added a little Easter egg that could justify the toys. We could see the green armor in the background at LexCorp. Or if Gunn wants to copy Marvel's playbook from the Infinity Saga, maybe Lex suits up in a post-credit scene, promising to go after Superman in the near future. But even if Gunn finds a way around this, Superman is still his biggest challenge yet. I explain why in this video.
Okay, see, this sounds like a challenge, and I love a challenge.